Everybody, my name is Medea, and thank you so much for coming today to our public talk, To Get Shot or Not, a talk on vaccines. So the event today has been hosted by the Public Science Institute. We're a new group just founded last year, and our mission is to make important scientific concepts understandable to anyone who is curious and to advocate for better science communication to the public. So like I mentioned, we were founded last year. It's a science communication and advocacy group consisting of scientists and communicators who share the goal of making science more accessible to the public. We have many projects on the go that we're getting started, today being our first project. We also do things like podcasts, science summaries, as well we're starting up a logic school. So we're currently only at 50 members, but we're growing and recruiting new members and volunteers every day. So if you kind of see what you like today, please feel free to pop us an email or join us. We're on Facebook, Twitter, we have our website here as well. Feel free to email us. So I will introduce our first speaker now. Dr. Evans is a virologist with basic and applied interests in orthopox viruses, as well as being an accomplished research administrator. His building and recruiting efforts have made Edmonton a center of excellence in virology due to investments in virus research from the CFI, Province of Alberta, and Li Ka-shing Foundation. He co-founded Alberta-based Prophesis Incorporated, and his patented virus technologies are licensed and commercialized worldwide. Dr. Evans sits on the World Health Organization Smallpox Committee, serves frequently as a reviewer, and consults for public and private agencies. He is currently the Vice Dean of Research here at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. So if we could please have an applause and welcome Dr. Evans.
And thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight and for the kind invitation to talk. I was given some instructions about what was I supposed to talk about, and the suggestion was I should talk about how vaccines work. Having to this day not fully understanding the details around immunology from my immunology colleagues, I'm just one of those virologists who they consider really ill-equipped to teach immunology. I'm not going to try and discuss how vaccines work from a detailed immunological perspective. It's a very complex field, and it'll take you down into the weeds very quickly and put you all to sleep. What I will try to do, though, is give you a little bit of a background about how vaccines were discovered and a very superficial perspective on how they work. And I'd be happy to answer questions at the end of the talk if you want more details. But for now, let's see how this works, and then we'll see how it goes. So I thought I'd better start by just explaining what is a vaccine. I think we all sort of think we know what that is, but this is kind of the scientific description. Apologies if this is something you already know, but I know we've got a very diverse group of people in the audience tonight. So there are lots of different kinds of vaccines out there, and we'll talk about a few of them later. But a sort of common feature to them is they all contain what are called antigens. So what's an antigen? An antigen is just a biological material that you would encounter in your day-to-day life. And for the purpose of this talk, an antigen is simply something that stimulates immunity. They can be many different kinds of things. They can be, do we have a pointer? Sorry, I didn't. Oh, okay. I'll use my mouse here. So they can be many different kinds of things. I mean, some vaccines contain antigens which are sugars. Some of them are proteins. And some modern vaccines are even based around DNA. But the common feature of them is that a vaccine can generate immunity an antigen can generate immunity if you're exposed to it. And the goal behind vaccination is that if we treat an individual or an animal or whatever with one of these antigens, and these antigens are taken from a disease-causing organism, what we can do is protect against that disease. And there are many ways of delivering it, as we would probably all have from personal experience discovered. You can eat them, you can be injected with them, you can even inhale them. Well, what are they for? I mean, the point of a vaccine is, again, a very straightforward thing. It's designed to protect you against future disease, basically. They work in all kinds of situations. They're used to protect humans and animals from that disease. And importantly, not only do they protect the individual from the disease, but if you have a high enough level of vaccination, you create what's called herd immunity, and you protect the population in general from disease. And that's very important from a human vaccine perspective, because if we don't generate enough immunity across the population, you're going to run into problems because individuals who might have failed to be vaccinated or have health issues could come down with disease. A thing I want to talk about is that vaccines also can be used to eradicate diseases. There have been some examples out there, and I'll talk about that. In some ways, that's the ultimate goal of vaccination programs. If we can eradicate a disease altogether on the whole planet, we can even quit vaccinating. They're very important tools of public health. In fact, they're one of the most important tools that the public health agencies have. And this is one of the key systems that keeps you healthy as a Canadian. All right, so how do these things work? Well, like I was saying, that tends to get into a lot of weeds if you're not careful. But what vaccines do is really exploit a very natural aspect of human biology. All right? You are basically wired to respond appropriately to a vaccine. All we're doing is taking advantage of that natural process. And the natural process we're pretty much familiar with. The first time you get sick or infected by some organism, we call them pathogens or infectious agents, call them bugs if you want, that's fine too. The first time you're infected with that, you will, in most cases, survive. Sometimes you won't. They're the ones we really want to worry about. And what will have happened as a course of that infection is that your body will sort of have been trained by encountering the antigens on that natural infection, and it'll develop a response that it'll store away, and it'll sort of be just sort of archived there. But then the next time you get exposed to that pathogen, that bug, that response can kick in extraordinarily quickly. So that, in fact, you may never even know you were infected because the immune system comes along, detects the infection, and shuts it all right down. The system that does this, like I say, is extremely complicated. It uses a whole variety of different pathogen sensors. It uses proteins called antibodies, which are specifically capable of recognizing, like a lock in a key, the pathogen or the antigen that pathogen is expressing. And also very specialized immune cells that can be, again, programmed to recognize a cell infected by that pathogen and to kill it. All right. We're actually still trying to work this all out. I mean, the broad details were worked out in the middle of the 20th century, in the late 20th century. But actually, immunity and how the immune system functions remains a very important element of understanding how to make transplants work better. How to treat cancer is becoming very well understood that we need to know immune responses to cancer cells if we're going to treat cancer properly. So it's a very active area of research, and like I say, happy to talk more if you're interested. So, how do vaccines work? I thought what I would do is simply explain to you from a historical perspective how the world's first vaccine was discovered and why it works. And I picked this one because I'm particularly biased about this subject. I work on pox viruses, and I'm very interested in the vaccine that was used to create protection against smallpox, and that's vacciniovirus. To make it clear, I do not work on smallpox, all right? In Canada, if I was, they'd put me in prison. It's illegal, all right? I work on vacciniovirus and other pox viruses. So, smallpox is a disease we don't see anymore, but it's a very old disease. We have records in China that probably go back 2,000 years of descriptions of the disease. It's caused by a virus we call variola virus. And kind of keep that in mind because that term will crop up a few times. It's a terrible disease. Depending upon the type of virus and depending upon the health of the population and the genetics of the population, it can kill up to a third or a half of the people it infected. Smallpox was the disease that was brought over by the Spanish conquistadores when they came to New World, and it was responsible for decimating the native populations of the Americas. And when I use the word decimated, I use the word in a proper sense. Up to 90% or over 90% of the indigenous populations died when they were exposed to smallpox because they had no history of immunity to it. The nasty thing about this is that if you survive an infection by smallpox, you're often left scarred for life, and you're sometimes blinded because the lesions can affect your eyes as well. So it's a terrible disease. But if there is one good thing about it, it is this scarring. Because a long time ago, people came to realize that that's interesting. Anyone who had those scars from a smallpox bout, and there's a picture here of a little girl from India who was actually the last person to get natural smallpox, the variola major strain, which was the really dangerous strain. You can see that little girl has lesions there's scars left all over her arms and her face. And people realized that was a marker of protection, that if you never would get smallpox again if you had those scars. So there was something going on here about an early infection that was protective. And probably around 1,000 years ago, again, these things are not quite certain, this may have been kept as a secret, Chinese doctors started doing something we call variolation. And, if you want to talk about dangerous vaccine practices, this was one, because really what they did was they took a lesion from someone who had smallpox and deliberately put it into the nose or wherever of a person who didn't have smallpox, who had previously been uninfected. And if it sounds dangerous, it is, but it's actually a lot safer than natural smallpox. We, again, don't know the exact frequency of disease, but maybe about 1 person in 1,000 would die versus 1 person in 3. So the odds are good, but it's still not a great vaccine as the vaccines go. So this practice spread out of China into the Middle East, and then finally by the 1700s it was being practiced in England. And actually Canada too. The British Army was vaccinated. And this leads us to the discovery of the modern vaccine by someone you may well be familiar with. That's Edward Jenner, an English country physician practicing in the late 1700s. And Jenner was a variolator. He was using smallpox to vaccinate people. But he was also, in those days, doctors were sort of transitioning from a very sort of traditional medicine mindset to the modern mindset we've got. And he was also very familiar with a concept in old traditional medicine, which is that like cures like. And he was aware of something that the local people were doing, which was that they were taking what they thought was something that looked like a smallpox lesion, but getting it out of cows and horses. And they were telling him, well, this works as well as does variolation. So what he did was he repeated their experiments. He took some material out of an infected cow or an infected horse, again, probably both were used, put it in the arms of someone, and then the big difference between him and his rural accomplices was that he did a challenge experiment. He was a variolator, so the little boy that got the vaccination with this material from a horse or a cow was then variolated and didn't get smallpox. So he basically, and then he publicized this in the scientific journals at the time. What he had discovered was the world's first vaccine, all right? And what was going on? Well, just to make sure we understand the terminology, he created the word vaccination to differentiate it from variolation. And it's called vaccination because he got some of the original material out of cows, all right? So like I say, it was much safer. What was he doing? Well, what he was doing was messing around with a virus that we now call vaccinia virus. And you can see the obvious etymology of the name. It's the first virus that was found in the first vaccine. Vaccinia is a big, complicated virus. I can bore you to death with talking more about it. I don't think you want to hear about that. It's a big, complicated guy. But what it does that we take advantage of the fact is it belongs to the same family of viruses that smallpox virus comes from, the variola virus comes from. And it's a close enough copy of the two, of the dangerous virus, that when you get vaccinated with vaccinia virus, your body gets fooled. And there's antigens in common between the vaccinia virus and variola virus. And your immune system kicks in to protect you against the vaccinia virus. But there's enough similarity between the two viruses that should you later get exposed to smallpox, you'll get protected. And so you take a safe agent to give you the immunity that protects you against the dangerous agent. And this swept the world. Within a few decades, vaccination was being used very widely. So nowadays, there are many other vaccine technologies that have been developed over the centuries, the 200 years since Jenner first described this process. And again, I can happily talk to you a little bit more about these later if you're interested. But broadly speaking, there's about 4 kinds of vaccines now out there, plus some sort of experimental ones that aren't so widely used yet. They all take advantage of the same principles. You deliver a dose of some antigen in a safe form, trick the immune system into generating an immune response to it, and if you get exposed to the live pathogen, you're protected. So, for example, we have things like killed vaccines. So, in a killed vaccine, what we're doing is we're taking the dangerous agent, killing it, heat or formaldehyde, so it can't infect you, but the antigens are still there, and you get injected with it, and you generate an immune response to that. Anthrax vaccine is like that, and many of the modern flu vaccines are killed vaccines. Another one is the attenuated live vaccines. What you can do is you can take the disease-causing agent and you can grow it and treat it in certain ways so that it mutates, and you mutate away the virulence so it's not capable of causing disease. Again, the antigens are still there. You get exposed to it, you get protected. The oral Sabine polio vaccine is like that. There's these so-called inactivated toxoids. The DPT, which is a topic of some conversation, has 2 toxoids in them. These are the toxins that come from diphtheria and tetanus, and they're inactivated, and you again generate immunity against those toxins to protect you. And then finally, a big area of research right now is in recombinant vaccines. This was a product of the molecular biology revolution. We can now take bits of these pathogens, express them in other forms, and use those as our antigens to generate protection. And the one most people would be familiar with is the human papillomavirus vaccine. That vaccine is actually made in yeast, basically a modified form of bread or beer yeast. And it's actually the coat of the protein. When you make this protein in a pure recombinant form, isolate it from yeast, and just put it in solution, actually what it does is it folds spontaneously into those structures, which is the capsid of the virus. But there's nothing inside. It can't cause infection. It's just the coat. But it does still have the antigens. It does still function as a vaccine. And we're still looking for vaccines. The hunt for an HIV vaccine has been going on now for 30 years. And actually many people feel that one we may never succeed at. Malaria is coming along well, though. So just to wrap this up, so what are these vaccines? They take many forms, but they all contain antigens. They're biological materials. They stimulate immunity. If we vaccinate, we can protect against these disease-causing agents, and there's many routes of delivery of those agents, of those vaccines. So what about smallpox? If you're my age, you've probably got a scar on your arm, which was a vaccination against smallpox. I'm actually one of the very rare people in this world that still gets them because of some of the work we do. We quit vaccinating against smallpox in Canada in the late 1960s because it had been eradicated from the Americas by that point. It's actually one of the few diseases that has been eradicated. There was a massive campaign around the world, massive vaccination campaign, followed by looking really hard for tiny little pockets of infection in some of the most difficult places to reach in the world, parts of India and Somalia and Ethiopia. But we got rid of all of it. And because of some unique features of smallpox biology, I mean, this doesn't infect animals, so it has no place to go. Once you've got it out of every human, it doesn't have a place to hide. So we eradicated it. It's one of those great public health triumphs that people forget about. It's truly a remarkable outcome, and we need to sort of remember that kind of, the value of that kind of work. Very recently, we've just eradicated a disease called rinderpest, which is a cattle plague, which was a devastating pathogen for small farmers in Africa. That one is gone now too. And we're just about on the edge of eradicating polio. 2 of the 3 strains are now gone from the wild, and there's one left still haunting bits of Pakistan, the borders around Pakistan. But we're close, so hopefully we can get rid of that one soon too. So just in conclusion then, it's vaccines along with clean food and clean water, which is what keeps you healthy. If a doctor comes along and says that we're the ones keeping you healthy, that's garbage. It's this basic public health that keeps you healthy. They take advantage of natural biological defense responses to pathogens. And these are basically, they're natural, all right? And I guess the question I would leave you with, who do you believe, Edward Jenner or Jenny McCarthy? So go and get your shots. I'll wrap this up by just acknowledging my work is funded by a great variety of people, of provincial and federal agencies. There's a disclosure there. I do have a company, and we're working on trying to develop using vaccinia as a tool for treating cancer. And I'll leave you with one last picture. People want to know, I don't know if you can see this very well at the back. This is a picture of a virus-infected cell, infected with vaccinia, but we've tricked it. We've put some fluorescent proteins in the virus so you can see where they are. And the blue is the nucleus of the cell. The red is sort of the place where the virus is being made. And every one of those little green dots is a vaccinia virus replicating in that cell. There's over 4,000. So you can see why pathogens are bad for you, and that cell's toasted, as you could sort of imagine. So just keep that in mind. That's what we're being protected against when we talk about the value of vaccines. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks.
Moment of Dr. Evans' presentation, you can feel free to ask.
Yeah, I can.
Otherwise, we can wait till the end.
Right there. Dangers from certain types of vaccines. Well, a general comment is that they are amongst the safest biologicals we use. If you are trying to develop a new vaccine, particularly for healthy individuals, the strictest rules in the planet from places like Health Canada and the FDA apply to vaccines. I don't quite know the exact numbers, but it's on the order of there has to be less than one bad outcome from a vaccination on the order of 1 million vaccinations or less. So it's extremely rare side effects from modern vaccines. Some of the very old vaccines do have side effects. The anthrax is notorious for being extremely painful and having some consequences. The reason why we quit using that smallpox vaccine was that the vaccinia virus killed about 1 person in 1 million. So when you still have smallpox around, that's a risk worth taking, but when it's gone, you quit using it. So the one other area that people have to really be careful of is that some of those live attenuated vaccines, you really shouldn't use them in individuals who have immune deficiencies. So someone who has, say, a suppressed immune system should not be vaccinated with those vaccines. And that's actually one of the reasons, I've talked to parents that are very, very upset about the anti-vaccination community because they've got children that are in that category that for one reason or another can't be given a vaccination. And this is where you rely on herd immunity to protect those people, that you shouldn't give that child some of these vaccines because of the risks for someone with an immune deficiency. But the way of protecting them is to make sure that all the healthy people around them are vaccinated so that disease isn't even here. So that's kind of a quick summary of some of the issues. Yeah. It varies depending on the vaccine, because all vaccines have a certain efficiency of take. So that depends on how antigenic they are, how many shots you get, and how long the immunity lasts. So there's no one simple answer, but I've seen numbers, for example, with the measles and stuff, they talk about sort of numbers in the 80% plus, and it is what you need to see to start protecting against those diseases. That's the sort of general rule of thumb. Yeah. Sorry? Zika virus. Well, my colleague Tom Hobman, who I share a lab with, has got it growing in the lab. There are rushes on right now to try and develop monoclonal antibodies to this, so we'd have a passive technology for treating them. I would guess there's some tricks. We can piggyback on some existing vaccines. I guess within a year we'd start to have some early vaccines. Now, whether they'll work is another question. I mean, the routes to doing it are pretty obvious, but whether they'll actually work in a clinical trial is anyone's guess. But I would guess within a year we'll be doing it quite easily. Yeah. Noro, yeah. Noro is an interesting problem. People have tried to make the vaccine for it. Well, okay, let's not. People have wondered whether it's even worth trying to make a vaccine for it. And the problem with Noro is that what seems to happen is that there's something funny about the virus, that the immunity you generate is very transient and runs out very quickly. So what will happen, and you can see it in the statistics in Alberta, is that you'll get an outbreak of Noro and it'll spike 1 year, right? And then it'll go away and disappear for a year or so, or be at very low levels. And then the following winter, it'll spike again, right? And sometimes it's the same virus with the same antigenic properties. And it suggests that there's something funny about human immunity to Noro, which causes it to decline very quickly. So that that leads people to speculate that perhaps we never could make a good vaccine, or if we do, it'll only last a few years and you'll have to keep getting shots every so often. Sorry? Okay, yeah, so yeah. No, there is interest in it. The one thing about Noro is it's also proven to be a virus that was very difficult to grow, and until very recently we couldn't grow it in the lab. But now that they can grow it, that'll probably advance the development of vaccines very much faster. Yeah. Oh. It's your question about assuming everything goes right. It's really hard to say. Do you have a thoughts on that?
18 weeks, 15 to 25 years or more.
Yeah.
It depends on what you're trying to test.
Yeah.
When you go from actually going out and listening and possibly work to get into clinical trial, to get approval by the government, it takes decades.
And money. That's it. We're working on trying to we have this, what's called an oncolytic virus. It's a modified virus for treating cancer. We're just starting the process of making the virus of a high quality purity that you can put into humans, and asking Health Canada for permission to do what's called a phase 1 trial. And even that first step, after years of research in the laboratory, even that first step will take us 2 or 3 years. We figure we might be in patients in 2 years' time. And that's a phase 1 trial. And then the practical reality is that there isn't enough money in academia to do it to go further than that. So you have to find a company who thinks it's worth investing in to then license the technology and then do the other trials to show it even works. All the phase 1 trials shows it's safe. Then phase 2, then phase 3 is to expand it. And the estimates are, pharma says it's a lot, other people say it's not quite so much, but the estimates are it's somewhere between $200 million and $1 billion to develop a new drug. And to give you an example, Gilead bought a company which had a functioning hepatitis C drug. So they knew it was going to work. It had passed the phase 3 trials. They paid $12 billion for it. So that's what these things cost to develop. So I can't answer your question really. It's a long, complicated story, and it drives me crazy. There was a question of it. Yeah, HIV has proven the best immunologists in the world have been working for about 30 years trying to figure out how to make a vaccine against HIV. The challenge with HIV is that it kills the very cells you actually need to generate a vaccine response. It infects and kills T cells. So trying to make a vaccine in that element of biology is really, really difficult. The other problem with HIV is that, it goes under the radar. It infects cells. They can disappear into your body for years, just residing as a provirus in the DNA. And you can knock the virus down with drugs to no detectable virus, and you can do that for years. The instant you take off the drug, back comes the virus. So it's evading the radar by just sort of settling into this quiet mode of existence. So it's a really stealthy virus, and that's what's called a reservoir. The fact that the virus can go into cells, disappear into your system, and not be seen for years is probably the reason why a vaccine will probably never work. A lot of people now are thinking there's a novel suggestion that actually the best way to eradicate HIV may be to put everyone in the world who wants to take it on antivirals. And the antivirals work extremely well. They'll take the level of replicating virus down to a point where you're just not infectious anymore. And so if you had everyone in the world who might be infected with HIV taking antivirals and good ones and doing it properly, you could, in a century, eradicate the virus. So, that's the next plan, I guess. Yeah. Why do some vaccines last and some don't? It's the nature of the immune response and how powerful the antigen is. So I don't have a really good I don't really have a good explanation for that. It just is that the smallpox, for example, that vaccine works. That's good for life. You can actually detect immune responses to pox viruses 50 years after you got the vaccination. It's probably because the antigens are so well recognized by the immune system that the response is extraordinary. The norovirus, though, for some reason, it just doesn't seem to trigger a very strong immunity. Perhaps because there are some, in immunology, there's a concept of self, that your immune system doesn't recognize you for good reasons, right? And so maybe there are pathogens that have exploited that, and their antigens kind of look a little bit like you. And so your immune system, it can trigger an immune response, but it's not a very good one because your body has decided, well, I shouldn't be recognizing that antigen. So that's one possible explanation why things fade. And then the other reason has to do with the nature of the response, antibody responses versus cellular responses, and there's different kinds of immunity. Some are longer lasting than other ones. So we can chat more if you'd like. Oh, yes.
There are some people who are concerned about the presence of mercury compounds in vaccines.
Of what's?
Untitled Public, I must have.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What would be the thought on that? Like after really said?
Well, those materials are put in there for stabilizers, like thimerosal is a derivative of, it's a mercurial compound designed to keep them sterile. I can't comment specifically on the safety profile of that, except to say that we've been using that forever. It's really interesting, actually. You know, when you take a look at these health regulatory agencies, one area where they are ultra conservative is vaccines. They will not change anything if they can do it, right? Because if there's a history of something working and being safe, they don't want people tinkering with it. So they've been putting that in forever because it's safe. This is actually frustrating for people developing new vaccines because there are technologies that can be, there are things that can be added to vaccines that would make them more active, that would give you longer lasting immunity. But the health authorities won't let you tinker with these things and add them. So, you know, these stabilizers are necessary. If you, glycerol is a common one that's put into things. You want to be sure that that antigen that you're delivering is stable, that it remains its potency, so that when it goes into the person, that it can trigger the immunity. Glycerol is there to help stabilize that and prevent it being sort of destroyed and degraded over the time. So these things are added because they're essential to stabilize and make the vaccine work. And so, and they have a long demonstrated history of use safely. So they're often described in a very, you know, glycerol, you know, that's an antifreeze too, right? So people say vaccines have antifreeze in them. Well, yeah, I guess they do. But glycerol has many purposes. It's also in a lot of skin creams and stuff as well, right? So they're not really as bad as people would say, and the levels of things like thimerosal are extraordinarily low anyway. Right? So that's a long answer to it. It's probably not a good answer. But.
Well, we talked about some different viruses, like vaccinated.
Yeah.
There's some people that don't develop immunity.
Yes.
Some ones like 96% will develop immunity. Measles after the first dose, and then it goes up to 99%.
Yes, that's correct.
And so what is it of the person's immunity that doesn't allow them to
Yeah, that.
immunity or keep immunity? Because some people have been vaccinated.
Yeah, I don't know the exact answer to why some people don't respond to vaccines. There's variable explanations I've seen over the years. One is the quality of the vaccine. So some vaccines are not as good as other ones. They vary a little bit from lot to lot, although they're not supposed to, right? I remember many years ago, my daughter actually got whooping cough, and my wife got whooping cough from her. And there was a bad batch of whooping cough vaccine that had been, my daughter had been vaccinated, but the quality of the vaccine didn't meet the standards that was expected. And so my wife, who had a very old vaccine, managed to catch it and tried explaining to a resident doctor that that's whooping cough. I can recognize whooping cough. No, it couldn't possibly be. We don't have whooping cough. But it was. So quality of vaccine is one issue. Some people just, there are genetic determinants to your capacity to recognize antigens. They're called the major histocompatibility loci in people. And they vary all over the place. All kinds of people have different HLA types, right? It's also the reason why you can't take transplants, because it's involved in rejection. Depending upon what your HLA type might be, will actually influence your response to a vaccine. And people, like, to think about those American Indians, the North American and South American Indians that were killed by the smallpox, what almost certainly happened there was that in Europe and Asia, where smallpox had been around for thousands of years, we had selected amongst those populations for genetic resistance to smallpox. We had the right capacity to recognize it with our immune system. And although it was still deadly, it wasn't as deadly as it was in Indian populations. In the New World, those people came over, and for 14,000 years, they lived very healthy, very happy lives. never encountering smallpox. So if they had the genetic systems capable of protecting you or helping you develop immunity to smallpox, they were lost, or they never were there in the first place, but it didn't matter. But then along came the Spaniards bringing their smallpox with them, and those populations were genetically very, very sensitive to the disease. So it all has to do with the genetic determinants of your immune response to an antigen, whether you can recognize it and how well you recognize it. Why did it leave a scar? Oh, well, because what it was doing was replicating in your arm and infecting the tissues there. And eventually your immune system came in and cleared it out, but in doing so, it essentially left damage behind, and that's the scar that you have. Yeah, yeah, it's actually it's called a bifurcated needle. It's actually sort of a modified sewing machine needle, and they used to punch your skin about 10 times, and that would put about 1 million virus particles into your skin, and it would replicate it. How many people still have a smallpox scar? Yeah, so I do. So, yeah, so. It hurts. I can assure you. Yeah, I've had several of them because I've actually visited the places where they still do smallpox research, and you have to have a up-to-date vaccination to go to those places. And I'll tell you, it's hard to get the vaccine. The government doesn't want to release it. And then most doctors won't administer it because they're scared of something happening. I had to go to an old colleague of mine who said, oh, yeah, I'll do it. So he hadn't done it in 30 years. He was reading the instructions, you know. Oh, yeah, what do I do? Oh, okay. I better quit.
Thank you. I think you have the mic.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yes. Okay, so at this point, I'd just like to introduce our second speaker. So Dr. Abagu is an assistant professor cross-appointed to the faculties of law and pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences. His research interests are in health law, public health law, science and health policy studies, law, bioethics, biomedicine, the legal history of public health, and healthcare in Canada and the law of torts. He is particularly interested in the points of confrontation between ethics, morality, economics, and law in relation to the governance of novel and controversial healthcare technologies. His current research work examines the history of smallpox, vaccination policies in 19th century Canadian society. He holds a research appointment as the Cates Research Fellow in the Health Law and Science Policy, and he's a member of the faculty's Health Law Institute.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to pick up from where Dr. Evans stopped. By show of hands, who knows the reference to Jenny McCarthy? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to talk about people who resist vaccination or who are hesitant to get it. And I'm going to essentially argue that the government needs to do something about that. And then I'm going to talk specifically about what the government should do about that and give reasons why I think the government should do something about that. The reason for that is that I think it should be clear to you now from listening to the first talk that vaccines are very important. I'm actually going to put this out there. There's two things that have been most important to the human race. You can look at all kinds of scientific discoveries out there, all things that have happened, iPads, iPods, cars, all that stuff. The two most important things that have saved us as a human race is one, separating poop from the water we drink, and two, vaccines. That's about it. Anyone who tells you anything differently is lying to you. Vaccines are so important, and there's all kinds of vaccines you can get. You can get them as a child, you can get them as an adult,
Today I'm going to focus on vaccines that are available for children. The reason for that is that I can't talk about every vaccine, and there are different kinds of issues that come up for different kinds of vaccines. Today my focus is going to be only on childhood vaccines because those have been shown to be safe and effective, and those are the ones we tend to argue about the most because, our poor little children, you're going to take them, you're going to put stuff in them, and people fear that. Parents are worried about it. And because parents are always very rational, when they worry about stuff, they yell loudly about it. And then the government has to react by making policy. So I'm going to talk about that. That's what my focus is going to be today. So what I'm going to end up with, so I'm going to start with my conclusion, and that is that we need to have legislation. The government of Alberta and governments everywhere in Canada should make laws that require every child who can get vaccinated to get vaccinated. And when I say every child who can get vaccinated, I mean every child except for those who can't, for medical reasons, get vaccinated or who will suffer from getting the vaccination because they're immunocompromised, they have immune-related problems. So only medical exemption or proof that you've had the disease before will be the exemptions that are allowed. Everyone else gets vaccinated. I'm going to argue against herd immunity. I'm going to argue against this notion that some parents are just hesitant and they're not anti-vaxxers or anti-vaccinationists. I'm going to just put everyone in one box because I'm a lawyer and that's what we do. Right? And then argue against herd immunity because I think that's freeloading and it's selfish. And then talk about why I think this is the right policy option. But let's go over the other kinds of options that are available to the government. They could do something called vaccinate or homeschool your kids, which is what California, West Virginia, and Mississippi in the United States do. That's the policy they have. You either vaccinate your child or your child gets homeschooled. Can't attend a school where there's other kids. Whether it's public or private, it doesn't matter. Well, that's good, but if disease comes around, right, that child is not protected. And we have to ask, should a parent be making decisions like this, where the child in question, the person who's going to be affected by the disease, is not protected? But that's certainly one option we can use. I think it's too late. By the time you homeschool the child, eventually the child is going to get the disease if the disease does come around. And if you get many people homeschooling their children, then you have a ton of kids in the population who are not vaccinated. We're going to look at a case study in Alberta where this is the problem. The second option is you could vaccinate or homeschool your kids.
Sorry, I'm just increasing the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You could vaccinate or homeschool your kids. But you can also then ask for a medical, religious, or philosophical exemption to allow your children to go to a public school or a private school. So unless you have one of those exemptions, your child can stay at home. Well, the problem again is, if somebody doesn't really want to get vaccinated or don't want to vaccinate their child, the minute you say you can have an exemption that's not medical, they are going to say, okay, well, give me the exemption. I'm not getting vaccinated. I'm not going to vaccinate my child. Then there's the option that we use in Canada. There's only 2 provinces in Canada that have any kind of policy on what to do with respect to childhood vaccinations. And that's Ontario and New Brunswick. And these 2 provinces say you vaccinate your child or your child will not be allowed to attend public school. But if you can show a medical, religious, or philosophical exemption, then your child can come to school. This is bad for all kinds of reasons. I think it's pretend policy. For obvious reasons. If you plead an exemption, your child gets to come to the school. The disease can get to the child. But more importantly, in Ontario, I don't know if you know this, in Toronto, they have schools called alternative schools. They are basically schools where there's like a big pox party going on, right? These are schools that are set up by parents who don't want to vaccinate. So what happens in these schools is that the rate of vaccination is very low. there's not enough coverage in those schools. It's as low as 40%. And if you think about herd immunity being in the 90% range for most of the childhood diseases, these are schools where children are under-vaccinated. If disease makes it into the community, as we saw with the last measles outbreak, this is like ground zero for disease when it comes in. You could do what we did in Alberta, because we have no policy. You wait for the disease to come, then you say, go home, right? That's what we did the last time. Measles came, and we're like, oh, you can go home now. Go stay at home. That doesn't make any sense. And then lastly, you could educate the people. You could you could do what we're doing here. Talk about the importance of vaccination, which is good too, but I'm going to share with you subsequently some studies that show that when people say they're not getting vaccinated, if you tell them to get vaccinated and you talk about all the stuff we're talking about today, they just go home and hate you, and their views become more entrenched. It doesn't actually change their behavior. People who don't want to do something are not convinced by education. Okay, so why vaccinate? I'm just going to put this out there. Vaccines are safe and effective. For childhood vaccines in particular, they are safe and effective. Anyone who has arguments about this, I've been out drinking with friends, and then there's somebody who comes along who's an anti-vaccinationist and starts to debate this with me. I'm like, you know what, I can't talk about this. I want to talk with you about this and reason with you about this and show you data, but there's no point, right? This is so convincingly proved. I know you might have heard about, the link to autism and all of that stuff. There's now over 1,000 studies, over 1,000, involving millions of people, millions of children, trying to find that link that haven't found any link to autism or to many of the things we fear. Vaccines, for the most part, are safe and effective. If you don't believe it, then maybe you still believe that the world is flat. We can argue that as well, right? But there's a number of very, very knowledgeable people, like Dr. Evans over here, who are working on this stuff and who have no reason whatsoever to deceive. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to assess what they do, to test what they do. You can debate it, but it's just not something that should be debated. But for the sake of argument, let's go over what we know about this. So this number 92, we have the Public Health Agency of Canada. They track what is called serious adverse events, which bad things that happen when kids get vaccinated in Canada. So for childhood vaccinations, they track serious adverse events. And serious adverse events for vaccines, for childhood vaccines, will be things like the child got sick, got a rash that didn't go away for a few days, got like some kind of fever that didn't go away for a few days. We're not talking death here. We're not talking anything major. They're serious, but it's not death or disability. That number 92, for vaccines given to children between when they were born and 7 years of age, across Canada, between 2011 and 2014, only 92 cases of serious adverse events. And all of this, none of this led to death or disability. It went away after a while, right? So this is how safe vaccines are. So for all the childhood vaccines. No, for following the vaccine schedule. So for all the kids who are eligible in Canada for vaccination. Right. It's a very high number. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a very, these are all the kids who are eligible for vaccination who received the vaccines. And vaccine coverage rates in Canada are pretty high. So we're talking in the millions. This number is insignificant. You get more kids who get injured in the playground. Children's Advil probably has worse stats than that. Right? So this is a very good number if you think about the safety and efficacy of vaccines. As I already said, vaccines is really the most effective tool we have for tackling childhood disease burden. Here's some stats from the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. In the US, among children who were born between 1994 and 2013, vaccination will prevent an estimated 322 million illnesses, 21 million hospitalizations, and over 700,000 deaths during their lifetimes. There's nothing else in science that will produce these numbers. This is pretty significant. This tells you about the importance of vaccines for children. Here's a chart I really like. On the red syringes give you a sense of the incidence of disease, how infectious diseases occurred in the population in the US before vaccines were introduced for all those diseases, right? And then the black syringes, or the disappearing red syringes, show you what happened after vaccines were used. Most of these diseases have either been nearly eradicated or eradicated. It is pretty significant how vaccines have helped the population. In Canada, if you take measles, which is the one that we've heard about recently, measles was actually eliminated in Canada in 1999 after we introduced a second dose of the measles vaccine. And then, since then, we haven't had any local cases, so no cases generated in Canada, but people have brought it into Canada. And because there are kids in Canada who are unvaccinated, measles has found a home, and that's why we've had recent outbreaks in Canada. So the reason we should vaccinate our kids is because all of these diseases are making a comeback. This is not a good news story. These diseases shouldn't make a comeback because there are vaccines available for them. And if everyone gets vaccinated, then these diseases won't have a way of coming back into our society. But they are all making a comeback. We had a measles outbreak recently, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Now, the reason why we have these outbreaks come back is because vaccine coverage is not optimal. I know you've heard a lot of talk about herd immunity, this notion that if there's enough people in the population who are vaccinated, then those who are not vaccinated will be protected. And that's what we generally use to estimate whether there's enough protection for vaccines in the population. But I think, and I'm going to argue, that herd immunity is actually not a good thing. Now, if you look at the 2013 Childhood National Immunization Coverage Survey, which is statistics put together by Public Health Agency of Canada about vaccine coverage in Canada, this is the latest stats that they have. So 1.5% of children across all age groups in Canada have not received any immunizations. The coverage rates vary from 73% for those diseases to 91% for polio. Polio is the highest rate of coverage, 91%. That is because even people who refuse vaccination have seen pictures of polio, not a good disease, right? So there tends to be this fear of disease that leads people to get vaccinated for some and not for other kinds of diseases. If you ask people what is, if you tell people about varicella, they're like, what is that? But if you say polio, like, get my kid there now to go get vaccinated, right? And that suggests something to me. If we had these diseases in our population and they were occurring at a rate which is visible to the rest of us, we'll have more people vaccinated. When we had the last measles outbreak in Alberta, there were lineups around the corner. And then you had to wonder, where were all those people before measles made a comeback, right? That's what tends to happen. The absence of disease makes the heart grow fonder. So this herd immunity thing, this notion that, if there's enough people vaccinated, I call it freeloading. I don't quite like it, and I'll tell you I don't like it. The first thing is, herd immunity is measured for the entire population. So herd immunity, why I don't like it. The first thing is, herd immunity is measured for the entire population. So herd immunity for Alberta, for measles, is 95%. If you hear that number, you'll think there's 95% coverage across Alberta. That's not true. The way the statistics is calculated is by averaging across the province. But there are some communities that have as low as 40 and other places that have as high as 80. When you average it, the number looks good, right? So it's like a fake score. It's like the grade I give my students. Don't tell them that. Now, so the other problem is it assumes that the population is randomly mixed, right? Everyone is, it's a story about one number that's an average for everyone, but that's not true. There's actually a great deal of variability in vaccination coverage. Edmonton has a number that's different from St. Albert. St. Albert has a different number that's different from Oyen. There's different rates of coverage across the province, and that number is in essence a fake number. So herd immunity ignores this idea of variability of vaccine coverage. But the reason I hate it the most is that, I've had friends who tell me, why should I get my kids vaccinated? There's herd immunity. I'm like, are you kidding me? I got my child vaccinated. Why should I expose my child to the dangers and then you freeload off my, so my child can get autism? Is that it? And then your child gets to benefit from that. I think it is scientific justification for selfishness, right? It is the most selfish thing you can do as a person. You say, oh, look, these other people have exposed their kids to danger. While, I can walk around saying, no, my child is not vaccinated, and I can have a choice in the matter because other people protect me. If you want to legitimize selfishness, there's no better way to do it than to cite herd immunity. And then there's something called vaccine hesitancy. That's the new buzzword that's been making its way around. And this is the idea that some parents are not actually against vaccination. They're not anti-vaxxers. They're just hesitant. They're not quite there yet. They worry about it. They're not really fine. The effect is the same, right? And there's good reason why parents react this way. The World Health Organization says there's a lot of reasons for this: misinformation, mistrust of the healthcare system, complacency. I just don't want to go there. I don't want to do this. And there's actually some other systemic reasons like lack of access to healthcare, poor access to healthcare. Lots of reasons why this problem arises. But the idea here is these things can be addressed. There's ways to address this. What you cannot address is when somebody says, I have all the information, I know what you're telling me, you've improved access, but I'm still not getting it. And that is the heart of the problem, and that has been something that needs to be dealt with. All right, so I'm going to skip through those because... Now, this is an article in The Economist that came out just a few weeks ago, and this kind of tells you how the media... so I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here about the media. How the media tends to confuse things. So this is in The Economist, very important magazine. And The Economist says, oh, look, everyone should get vaccinated. That's a good way to start. It's about vaccination. The main message in this article is that vaccine coverage rates is not a matter of GDP. There's countries that are more developed, like Canada and the US, actually have worse vaccination rates right now than countries that are resource poor. There's worse vaccination here than in poorer countries, right? Here's a map that illustrates that point. So if you look at this map, the US has worse coverage in terms of vaccination than Rwanda. That is ridiculous on so many levels. Rwanda doesn't have the kind of healthcare system that the US has. But you can see that countries that are actually much more developed economically have less coverage than countries like Sri Lanka, Rwanda, and Eritrea. And this sort of illustrates the problem that I'm getting at. In countries where you have access to healthcare, where vaccination is free, where you can walk into a place and get vaccinated, parents still refuse to get their children vaccinated. It tells me something. One is that it's because we don't have disease. If you have disease, people tend to get vaccinated. The second thing is because governments here have failed to be brave about this, right? They fail to realize that there's one fundamental thing here at play. That is that if these diseases make a comeback here, it's going to create a problem for persons who cannot get vaccinated for medical reasons, for the population in general, and it's going to take us back to the 19th century and to the 18th century, to a time when disease actually did things that were really bad to the population. And so I think the government needs to act to address this. This article makes a lot of other claims that I'm just going to skip in the interest of time. But let's talk about a case study, and so you begin to see how these two arguments are made about herd immunity not being a thing that I like, and that no one should support, how it can actually be a problem for how you address vaccine coverage. Okay, so I'm going to take the measles outbreak in Alberta that we had in 2013-2014 as my case study. For that outbreak, the herd immunity target for the province, so the number of persons in the province who need to get vaccinated for us to have protection is 95% of those who are eligible for vaccination. That's the target for Alberta. The highest rate we have is 84.8%, right? That is the highest. We're not even at herd immunity for measles, and we're not for most diseases. It's 77 for 7-year-olds from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. This tells you that people whose parents are richer tend to get vaccinated more than those whose parents are poorer. So that suggests that there might be something there about socioeconomic barriers to vaccination. But the stat that I really like is this one. In some communities in Alberta, mostly in southern Alberta, the coverage rates are very low. So when you see that herd immunity number, it doesn't tell the true story. In places like in places like Fort Macleod, the rate is 46.6% for 2-year-olds who are eligible for vaccination. For Oyen, that is the highest in southern Alberta. In southern Alberta, the community with the highest coverage rates has 71%. That is low. If measles comes into that community, it will affect kids in that community, without a doubt. If you have a relative in Fort Macleod and you hear measles, get them out of there, because there's a chance it's going to affect that community. So what's up with southern Alberta? Why are the rates so bad in southern Alberta? Long story short, it is made up of communities where people don't like getting vaccinated. They just don't like it. Mainly for religious reasons. But you have anti-vaccinationists in southern Alberta. They wouldn't even, they wouldn't entertain. It's not like they're hesitant. They just don't want it. And they set up their lives to resist it. They will homeschool their kids, or they will send their kids to schools where they are not required to get vaccinated. So they purposefully avoid vaccination. And most of them live in communities that are sort of closed off to everyone else. They're homogeneous, non-immunizing communities in southern Alberta. So they don't benefit from herd immunity. A study done by some really smart people at the University of Lethbridge at the height of the measles outbreak concluded that in these communities, the rates are so low because these parents set up their lives so that their kids don't get vaccinated. So these communities are very similar to the Toronto schools that I talked about, where children don't get vaccinated and they're allowed to go to schools that are called alternative schools. Okay, so here's what happened with that measles outbreak. Ground zero, which is that red dot in the middle, is where the measles outbreak started from. And that's a community in Lethbridge. It's a community that is a non-immunizing community. They don't get vaccinated because of religious beliefs. The belief is that God controls everything, and if you can't run away from God's will, essentially. If disease is going to get you, it's going to get you, so we're not getting immunized. It's that simple. And I respect that. But a kid from that community went to see relatives in the Netherlands who also don't get vaccinated. That kid came back with measles. He brought the measles to that red dot. So that's a 13-year-old kid. And then took it to school, and the outbreak spread from there. Now, if this happened in a community where nearly everyone who could get vaccinated was vaccinated, that kid cannot spread that. But because it happened in a community where many of the parents are not immunizing, that disease was able to spread in that fashion. Now, the thing you see here, that's the Edmonton outbreak. This one was brought into Edmonton through the Edmonton airport. But you can see that that didn't turn into that. That is because we have higher rates of coverage in Edmonton, and the disease was quickly suppressed in Edmonton. But over in southern Alberta, it did make its way and spread much more quickly. And the reason for that is that we keep talking about herd immunity, but the truth is, there are communities that don't get vaccinated, and when the disease comes in, it's going to affect kids in these communities. You can't have coverage that is optimal for protecting against diseases if you don't actually come up with policy that ensures that there's no child left behind, that most children get vaccinated. So the moral of the story, and I'm coming to the end of my talk, is that if you want to make policy to address this, you should have policy that ensures that most children in the population who can get vaccinated are vaccinated. You don't want a situation where kids in Edmonton who are from richer neighborhoods get vaccinated, but the poorer kids don't get vaccinated, or the kids in southern Alberta whose parents have an objection and won't let them get vaccinated don't get vaccinated. You want to sort of deal with this, what I call the unethical reliance on herd immunity. I think it's wrong. I really do think this is wrong for you to say, I'm protected because other people have exposed their child to the risk that I fear. It is not fair for us to allow people to benefit from the risks that we've taken. If as a parent I decide that I'm going to expose my child to vaccines, you shouldn't be able to benefit from that. We're all in this. The thing about these diseases is that they affect us all. So you cannot say my individual liberty is something that I hold over your own interests and then benefit from that. We also have to deal with pockets of avoidance, with people who refuse to get vaccinated and who live in communities where coverage rates are so low. So what I'll argue for is that this is not a choice but a requirement. I think the government should enact policy that says every child should get vaccinated unless you have a medical reason not to. Now, the one question I get when I say this is, if you do that, are you going to throw people in jail? Are you going to throw parents in jail? No. When you wake up in the morning and you leave your house, the minute you wake up, in fact, before you wake up, all kinds of government policies and laws start to affect your life. You get into your vehicle, if you have one, and you're driving and you get to a red light. Maybe you don't like red lights. I don't. Right? Like, I want to just blast my car through this thing and keep going. Right? I don't like anything that stops me, but I respect it because I understand its value. Do I like seatbelts? Maybe not, but I respect it. There are all kinds of laws that affect us. Why is this different? Why do we allow people to spread disease and say they have the right to do so? So I think that's a conversation we need to have. There needs to be something said about the fact that people resist this. But I think if you make policy that says it's mandatory for everyone to get vaccinated, I wouldn't recommend throwing people in jail. I think over time, people will see the value in following the law because we're law-abiding people. We like law. We respect law. We generally believe in law. We're a law-abiding society. Over time, people will see the value. And if it's made compulsory, that will force those who resist it to actually start asking questions. They'll go to their doctor and say, why is this compulsory? Can you explain to me why it's compulsory? Those who are complacent, those who sit back, will then be forced to ask questions because they've not been told that they should do it. But if somebody really wants to know whether there's justification for going beyond that, we already have laws that deal with that. Presently in our society, you can't deprive your child of food. You can't deprive your child of shelter, of clothing. Someone from child welfare authorities will swoop in and take your child. And we're okay with that. If you can not get away with depriving your child of food, why should you get away with depriving your child of protection from what we know is something that can kill the child? So it's something to think about. I know it sounds controversial. I know it's perhaps something that most people are uncomfortable with. But I'm giving a public talk where I want to generate controversy. So that's my starting point. I welcome your questions. Right. So we actually have laws that protect those things. Religious autonomy and freedom of expression and all that stuff. We have a constitution that has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects that. Right? So it's a really good point. However, that charter says that whenever your individual rights come up against the welfare of the collective, then we'll have to think seriously about how you express those individual freedoms and whether you should take a backseat to collective welfare. Vaccination laws have been challenged from back in the 19th century. That's what I studied for my PhD dissertation. All kinds of challenges to vaccination laws. And in almost every case where it was challenged, the court said, no, when individual liberty comes up against community welfare, individual liberty has to take a backseat. Right? And that is consistent with medical ethics. If you saying you have individual freedoms or the freedom to have religion or expression or all of that is something that will implicate someone else's freedoms in a negative way, it is accepted in ethics and in law that that has to take a backseat to community welfare. And this is a perfect example of the application of that principle. If you don't get vaccinated, you're going to transmit disease to someone else. It is about the welfare of the collective. If someone lived on an island, you can express untrammeled, uncontaminated liberty. You're by yourself. You can do whatever you want. But the reason why we have laws that sometimes say we have to push those things we have to push them back and they have to take a backseat is because it affects the welfare of others. So I think this is consistent. What I'm proposing is consistent with medical ethics and with law.
The law of preferred explanation, does it work better in healthcare systems that are publicly funded because of how we understand the economic costs of disease burden? Would it work equally well in an American society where people with rights consciousness is much higher?
Right. So yes. In the US, they actually are further ahead than we are on this. Even in the US, right? Several states in the US have compulsory vaccination in the form of vaccinate or homeschool your kids. So they have school entry requirements. But they started to think about actually going further than that. Now, I'll talk about two cases that came out out of the US. In 1915, some pastor, a guy called Hennepin Jacobson, it's a very cool name, challenged a law in Boston that said he must get vaccinated against smallpox or go to jail and pay a fine. He challenged it. The case went up all the way to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court said, yeah, we understand that you have individual liberties and all whatnot, but sorry, you can't spread smallpox if you don't get vaccinated, so you have to get vaccinated or face the consequences. This was in 1915. Just 2 years ago, a parent in New York did the same, challenged a New York law that said, vaccinate your child or keep the child at home. And the US Supreme Court, the court in New York said, well, that 1915 case is still valid, right? In the United States, it is accepted as a matter of law and ethics that if your freedom implicates public health in that way, it has to take a backseat. They actually understand it better than we do in Canada. All the 50 states in the US have some kind of policy on vaccination. In Canada, we have only 2 provinces, and their policy is not, to my mind, even a serious policy. So the US is actually further ahead, and this is with all the talk about the US being the free world and individual liberty max. Yeah, so as I stated at the beginning of my talk, not all vaccines are created equal. Some vaccines, like the flu vaccines, they change from year to year. They provide variable immunity depending on the strain that it's targeting, and because they are vaccines that address known strains and not unknown strains, chances are you might still get the flu if you get vaccinated. I still think that for vaccines like the flu vaccine, everyone needs to get vaccinated because it's not about you. Most of us who are healthy and adults who are healthy and young and fit will survive a flu attack. The problem is you take it to someone who cannot, right? So I still think everyone should get vaccinated for the flu. But would I support compulsory vaccination for the flu? Perhaps not. I can see how somebody can say, no, I'm not going to do this because it doesn't provide the kind of immunity that childhood vaccines provide. But there are certain classes of persons that I think should get vaccinated, even for the flu vaccine. If you work in a healthcare institution, yes, you should. If you work with persons who might be immunocompromised, yes, you should. If you're going to get anywhere near my children, yes, you should, right? But with those kinds of vaccines, with travel vaccines, with flu vaccines, perhaps there's an argument to be made for using other kinds of policy initiatives more. But for the ones that provide near complete immunity and which are deemed to be safe and effective, especially the ones for children, I think those should be made compulsory. I don't know what the proportion is, but it's usually very low, generally for most of you're not going to get a child who needs a medical exemption for all the vaccines, right? It's variable. It depends on the type of vaccine you're talking about. The numbers are really low. That's the one thing I know. And most of the situations that lead to an exemption are temporary. So the child might have a situation now that will make them not get vaccinated, but that is something that's addressed as the child grows older. So I'll give you an example. My wife and I, we had a child who was born 10 weeks early. And so, that happened right in the middle of the measles outbreak. So, we couldn't go anywhere for weeks because we were worried about that. But that's a child who would have been exposed to measles, and that would have caused her severe problems. She also did not have the kind of, she was not in a position to handle any kind of vaccines at the time. And an infection would have been really disastrous for her. So if, say, there was a requirement for her to get vaccinated at that point in time, she wouldn't be able to get it. But, she's now 2 years old. She's running around all over the place. There's no reason for her not to get vaccinated. So sometimes it's temporary. Sometimes you get people who cannot have it at all for medical reasons, but the number is usually very low. Well, so I think generally speaking, when you going to get vaccinated, you get asked some questions. People who administer vaccines ask questions about medical history. They want to know about what's going on with the child. It's something that you can discuss with your doctor as well if you're worried that your child might have a reason not to get vaccinated. For the most part, most kids in the population don't have these issues. But if your child is someone who falls into that category, there's going to be something that clues you into that, maybe through the child's medical history or through something that your doctor has informed you about. So your doctor will let you know if your child is kind of child who shouldn't be receiving vaccines in general. It's part of the consultation you do with doctors routinely, and they will inform you if there's any reason why your child should not get vaccinated. But again, the numbers are very low for people who are in that category.
Yeah, this is a more general question, but I was like, obviously vaccination protects the person from one particular disease, right? But I've decided that, over 2 years, for example, in 2 shots every year, it makes your immune system weaker, and then you become more susceptible to other diseases. For example, if you're traveling to other countries like India, you have the chance of getting it. Is it true, or
That is not true. That is simply not true. It is
doesn't make your immune system weaker, like if you take flu vaccine.
He's been studying this for years.
Your immune system does decline with age.
Right.
That's why the elderly have a problem responding to that. But
No.
having a range of vaccines is fine. Accumulated over time. I was traveling once with someone who did a tremendous amount of inspection of facilities in one country. You know those yellow cards, the old yellow cards we stamp with vaccine? He had one that went like this, and then another one. And then he had 3 of these things filled with the rafters, so he was still walking around.
Yeah, I have a question for you guys to create a policy with vaccines. How do people get kids in the government to actually enact that in terms of losing votes?
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part of it, right? I suppose by talking to people about this and trying to get that message out there, it is enough people in the population who actually think that it should be done. If public opinion is on the side of what I'm saying, then eventually the government will listen to that. The problem, of course, is there's not enough people talking about it. There's a very Canadian approach to talking about this issue. Canadians live and let live. Don't talk about anything about forcing people to do stuff. Let's all get together and live together and all whatnot. That is the kind of thing you hear academics say about this. I went to a thing in Ottawa that was put together by Health Canada, CIHR, and everyone there, they couldn't even call it what it was. They couldn't even say anti-vaccination. They were all saying, oh, no, it's vaccine hesitancy, I'm like, listen, people don't want to get vaccinated. Can we just talk about that? Can we actually say what's going on here? That is the problem, right? Until you actually start talking about the problem and making people know and getting them to talk to people who are in government, no one is going to actually put this on the table. All the proposals I've seen on this are half measures. Wait till they get ready to go to school, then do something about it. Even that is difficult, but that's because no one actually wants to talk about it. There's a definite silence around this issue, even though we know it's a problem. Right. Right.
And so what it is like we cannot financially afford a modern healthcare system.
Right.
And that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I quite agree. The problem, though, is we also have a healthcare system where you've said it doesn't matter what you do and how you bring yourself to a hospital, we're going to treat you. The whole thing is not sustainable, and that's not because of people who are refusing to get vaccinated. If you go bungee jumping at West Edmonton Mall, and I really should say to you before you do that, do you know what might happen if you injure yourself and how much money you're going to take away from Albertans? The problem is that whenever you make economic arguments in trying to create policy, people recoil at that. People don't like that argument. They're just something about, oh, because of money, right? Even though it's the truth. The truth is it's money. Dr. Evans talked about the fact that we need so much money to support research. We could direct the money elsewhere instead of using it to solve problems that can be addressed with a single shot. The issue, though, is that the minute you mention money, for some reason, people just get really mad that you're saying the reason why we have to do something is to save money, even though it's the truth. So I quite agree with you.
Yeah, there's a recent study is for every dollar we spend on vaccines, you save like $55 in healthcare.
Right. Yeah, but I think it's true, but people just don't think it's a good justification for advancing policy. And why that is, I do not know, but they just don't think it is. I think it's urgent. The reason for that is that these diseases are making a comeback. There's new diseases coming out. But more importantly, the messaging from those who don't want you to get vaccinated is getting stronger, right? There's a ton of messaging out there about why you should not get vaccinated. And nothing is being done to counter those messages. The number of people who resist vaccination is growing, not shrinking, right? So it's not getting better. That's the problem. And if it's not getting better, very soon you're going to have more people a lot of people in the population who are not vaccinated. And the reason why that can happen is because we're fortunate not to have diseases. The minute you start to get diseases, make a comeback on a frequent basis, then it becomes a problem. That measles outbreak showed us what can happen when we don't do something about it. It starts in Alberta, it's in BC, it's in Saskatchewan, it's in Ontario. It's making the rounds everywhere, right? And there's more and more people who are resisting vaccination. I have friends in the city who are very well educated, who can of course go to their doctor and get information. They have graduate degrees. There's no reason for them. They know how to assess information and understand it and parse it and do all of that stuff. But they had a child, and the next thing I'm dealing with anti-vaccinationists. And I'll go over to their house, and they'll say, come in through the side door, go into this bathroom, and wash your hands. And I'm like, what do you think that's going to do? Like, I could sneeze on your child, even if I finish doing that. I could wash my hands and sneeze on your child, but they were not having it. And it surprised me to know that they could actually be that way the minute they had a child. And there's now studies that show that people who are actually not the kind of people who will resist vaccination are beginning to resist vaccination. It's no longer a fringe movement or idea. It is something that is getting into the population and it's growing. Right. Plus, there's a lot of misinformation as well.
I think part of the problem is we created a double-headed monster because by eradicating or almost eradicating polio, which is what I had when I was 9 months old, what we've done is we've taken the fear away from people that it can happen again. As long as one child in the world has polio, every child in the world is at risk. We need to bring the fear back because nobody wants to live with something like polio that will affect your whole life, will affect everything that you do. I was born in 1956, and so the vaccination just came out. So when I was born, they weren't giving vaccinations to babies, they were giving them to 1 and 5-year-olds. So I didn't get the vaccination. My mom would have done anything in the world to be able to vaccinate me, to protect me from what happened. That didn't happen. They didn't think, because once they got the vaccination, there weren't going to be any more cases of polio. So when I got polio, they thought I was pneumonia, and I was hospitalized for pneumonia. We have to think about others, not just our own children, because our own children will be affected if we don't take the step. We need more public education. We need people like myself to go out and say, guess what? It's still here. I haven't found a doctor that knows very much about polio because we've done such a good job of getting it out of the way. But that's caused an issue because now people don't know what the cause and effect of polio is.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I certainly think that the absence of disease is what creates the complacency, and people just don't have the fear of it. Every year when I teach my students this topic, I take a poll. I say, who here knows any of these diseases and what they feel like? And there's no one. Pretty much everyone in maybe Generation X coming forward does not actually have an idea of disease, right? You get the flu, and like, it's the flu, but there's serious diseases out there that if they were in the population, people will be more worried. As I said during the last outbreak, parents lined around the block the minute measles got into the community, right? So you're right. And I think one way of dealing with that is to actually force parents to know about it, to address their fear. If you say it's compulsory, they will ask questions. They'll go to their doctor and say, why do I have to get this? And then the doctor will say to them, here's why you need to get it. right? I also do think, that the government needs to establish, and this is something I need to talk about very quickly. Canada is the only country among G8 countries, the big ones, who have lots of money and stable governments and all whatnot, that does not have a vaccine injury compensation scheme. Just Canada and Russia, Canada and Russia, the two places that don't have a fund for compensating persons who suffer vaccine injuries. And I think if you do that, that will give people confidence that if something were to happen, they could actually get compensation.
I'm just curious, if people actually think that it seems to prove that vaccines are harmful, I think then an action would be our compensation, because they're actually, because they are so rare, we actually don't know that they're actually caused by the vaccine.
So the evidence doesn't back that up. Quebec has one, and there's not been a reaction in Quebec to the vaccine injury compensation scheme. Quebec is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has one. And people haven't, at least from what data they've been collecting in Quebec, there's not this feeling that just because that exists, that means that you're trying to trap us into getting injured.
I would think a better policy would be to support the injury, like, no matter what the cause is.
Well,
Provide the healthcare, the transport, so it doesn't matter what the cause is.
Well, that is true as well. But in the other G8 countries that have the compensation scheme, there's not been, a reaction to that, as people are not blaming that as some kind of conspiracy to drug them into getting vaccinated. But it does give a level of, right? Well, internet.
The real challenge with getting people to appreciate risk, and I think why you're right, that the legislation is required, is because if you want an example of lack of appreciation of risk, go and drive around the outside and take a traffic analogy. At around 8:30 in the morning, and look at the number of very large, very heavy trucks driving 2 inches away from each other in the snow at 70 miles an hour. They have total disregard for their lives and other people's lives. You can't educate those people about this. They just don't care about it.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, I think the thing about risk, and I didn't get to this because I wanted to get to the discussion. The problem with people who already have an objection to something is that you're educating against the wind, really. Their starting point is not your starting point. The more you say, the more it sounds like, oh, whose pocket are you in? Is Big Pharma paying you to communicate this message to me? I read on the internet, this other person told me about this. So they're not in a position to appreciate risk because for them, it's an argument. It's not an exchange of facts, proven facts. And the way they say it is what you're telling them to do poses a greater risk because they've already analyzed risk in their own heads and they decided that the risk of getting vaccinated is more, right? So they appreciate risk, but just the wrong kind of risk. For them, it's getting vaccinated poses a greater risk than not getting vaccinated. And so you're working against that. And they have all kinds of arguments. My friends that I referred to, for example, said, the first thing they said to me was autism. I then did the one thing that somebody who is a public health advocate should never do. I produced studies. They then attacked the studies. Then attacked me for believing the studies, right? I then said to them, okay, well, the autism story is based on one study that has been disproved in all kinds of ways. And I'm showing you numerous studies that have not been disproved in any kind of way. They're like, yeah, that guy is the truth sayer. And these other people, scientists, are in the pocket of Big Pharma. You just can't work it. I mean, it is what it is.
But it's worse than it. It's not just that study was disproved. The guy made it the data. It's not just disproved.
Well, the same guy.
But scientists are just too polite to each other to use those words.
Right. Well, that's true. But Andrew Wakefield also just a month ago made a documentary. So do you guys hear about this? So he made a documentary which he wanted to show at there's a film festival, right? So Robert De Niro, who we all know is the person the founder of the film festival, and Robert De Niro has a child who has autism. So he went to Robert De Niro and said, here's my movie, my documentary, where I basically repeat everything I said in the paper that has been shown to be false. Will you show my movie? And Robert De Niro is like, of course we'll show your movie, right? And there was a huge backlash. And then Robert De Niro said, we're not showing the movie anymore. But, I mean, that's Robert De Niro. I mean, I've seen that guy, I love his movies. I think he's a smart person. But even him could not assess sort of those two stories. And he was willing to give a chance to someone who has been shown to be a fraud. Oh dear. That's a loaded question. So decisions about what kinds of vaccines to provide to the public or to pay for are made by government, right? Based on recommendation from scientists, policymakers, people who know about government spending, people who know about what you should spend money on or not spend money on, resource allocation people. There's a ton of people, experts who are involved in making a decision. And it's, to simplify it, it's something along the lines of, if it's cheap and it will provide the most benefit, we're going to go for it. Generally speaking, that's roughly how it happens. If it's cheap and it's going to provide a ton of benefit, we'll pay for that. We can't pay for everything, obviously. So there's all kinds of criteria that apply, but generally speaking, that's what it is. For childhood vaccines, because of the stage where children receive it, because of its importance in protecting children and the population, and because they're generally things that are cheaper than perhaps the HPV vaccine, those are supported by government and paid for. But there's some vaccines that are quite expensive to produce, and then so they are expensive for the government to buy, and so the government decides we're not going to support those because it's also targeted to a specific section of the population and not to everyone. So there's a method to the madness. But generally speaking, if it's cheap and it's going to help a lot of people, the government will buy it.
Comment. The other factor, of course, is the cost-benefit ratio. At the end of the day, there's those folks money to go around. You can build safe roads and save lives that way, or you can vaccinate and save lives that way. Someone's got to decide which is the best way to spend money that is the most value, right? So in the case of an HPV vaccine, at the end of the day, the health economists would actually look at the situation and say, how many lives have we lost from cervical cancer or head and neck cancers? How much will that cost the healthcare system to treat those people? How much economic impact would be from the lives lost there? Versus how much will it cost to give everyone a vaccine? And someone has to make that hard decision and says, you know, at the end of the day, the disease is going to cost us less than the prevention. And that decision has to be made. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
And I think the health ministry has to defend it, but it has to be made at some point.
Good question. So at this point, both the speakers are up at the front, so if you have a question for Dr. Evans that you're about to ask, you can go and ask at this point. So I have two questions.
Okay.
The first question is, so recently there's been a couple cases in the news about children who have become really ill or in some cases died because their parents chose not to vaccinate them. And in some cases, lawsuits are being brought against the parents. So can you speak to whether those lawsuits will actually go anywhere, whether something will happen? And the second question, you spoke about mandating vaccination in children. What about healthcare workers? So nurses, therapists that work with patients as well.
Okay, so I'll start with the second question because that one is a lot easier than the first one. So that was tried in BC, British Columbia. If you're a healthcare worker, you have to get vaccinated for the flu or you stay home, right? There was a huge controversy around that. Unions in British Columbia, so workers' unions that represent healthcare workers in British Columbia, didn't like it. They didn't like the policy at all. They felt it was, all the arguments came out. It's an infringement of their personal liberty. If you don't want to get vaccinated, why should you be forced to get vaccinated? This is not what we agreed on when we decided to get into an employer-employee relationship. And so the BC government backpedaled. But here's the interesting thing. while the policy was in place, vaccination coverage rates spiked. It went up so high that the BC government actually regretted rescinding the policy, right? And they rescinded it because of so much pressure coming from the unions. But it actually had an impact in the short period of time, right? And I think it made a lot of sense. I think if you're somebody who decides to become a doctor or a nurse, you're not me. I don't care about people as much as you do. You don't become a doctor because you woke up one morning and decided I need a job. No, there's something that led you there. If not, everyone will become one. You spend all those years in school, you really care about people. Part of that caring is that you have to understand that when you walk in there, the things you bring to them and the things you take away from there can affect other people. And it's unfortunate that there are people who get into that position and don't understand that that's part of their job. And I think it was the right policy and it should not have been rescinded, but it happened. On the second question about what should happen to parents who, I think it shouldn't happen in the first place. It shouldn't happen that a child has to die and then we'll talk about what's going to happen in lawsuits. Very recently in Alberta, we had parents whose child had a viral meningitis and they went to a naturopath and they used echinacea and the child died. And the parents are now in court facing a lawsuit, facing possible jail time, but the child is dead. What does it matter, really, what happens now? It only serves to be, like a message to other parents. I think we need to have policy that's proactive so that children don't die from things that are preventable. That's the best I can do with that. I don't really support throwing parents in jail after the fact. It doesn't do anything for anyone.
But if I could add a comment, the naturopath should be held accountable.
Yes.
If you're claiming that you can treat disease and someone dies, you should be held accountable.
The problem with that, though, is that the province gave them a license.
I know.
So, yeah. Talk about bad policy. Yeah, no, there's claims about that, but nobody has actually shown any data to back that up. So it's, for the most part, he said, she said. People talk about mistrust in the healthcare system, but I don't know. There seems to be a claim that people tend to make when they say, why are people going to naturopaths, why are people going to homeopaths, why are they not seeing their doctors anymore? There's this talk about doctors don't have time for people anymore. People, the healthcare system doesn't care about us. It's all about, putting drugs in you. Perhaps that's true. I just don't think that that's what's actually causing the problem. I don't think there's enough of that going on. Maybe there are people who feel that way, but no reason in isolation can be blamed for this. I think there's misinformation, a ton of misinformation out there that contributes to the problem. I think there's complacency because we just don't know disease anymore. All those factors sort of work together to create vaccine hesitancy. It's not just mistrust of the healthcare system. And there's actually studies of public trust in different kinds of actors that show that doctors, particularly the ones that work in the public healthcare system, tend to be trusted more than, say, bankers and other kinds of people out there. So I don't know if that's actually true. I think it's just something that people say. It's more of a myth.
So last question.
So I have a couple of questions. The first question is simple and factual. So I was just wondering if there is any statistical evidence as to the people who have vaccine hesitancy or people who do not want their kids to be vaccinated are the ones who were not vaccinated themselves as kids?
No, but that's interesting. That's it. That's a study someone should fund. We'll talk to them about why, whether they were not, I'm not sure. I don't think I've seen any data on that, on whether vaccine hesitant parents are the ones who are not vaccinated themselves. The truth is that perhaps anyone my age going forward probably got few to no vaccinations, because, I grew up in a system where there was no routine childhood vaccinations. I had chickenpox as a child, and I remember it. Don't want that in my life. So the minute I got to Canada, I marched up to the clinic and I got myself vaccinated for everything. just to be sure. Just give it to me, the whole, because I don't want disease. But most people who grew up like where I grew up in would not have most of that. There are people who live in Canada that I've talked to who went to pox parties, like their parents would take them to infection parties. There are people who, you haven't heard of those? So people who don't like vaccination will go to a party where they bring their kids and then they'll get one kid to infect everyone. Because infections are fun. There's all kinds of people who, in my generation and earlier, who might not have been vaccinated. But I don't know if there's any link between not getting vaccinated and not wanting your child to get vaccinated. So there's some studies in California that show that people who don't get their kids vaccinated tend to be middle class to upper middle class, usually very well educated, usually, somewhat affluent. They just either read too much or read too much bad information. That's the most that I know about it. What's the second question?
The second question is effective, and I was just wondering, because you said that in America, in the United States, there's a lot of policies about vaccination, but your World Health Organization draft said that America is one of the countries where it has not even reached the threshold.
Right. So the problem with that, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just wondering whether evidently policy is not doing what it is supposed to do. So we can enforce a lot of policies here, but is that really going to do what we want?
But it's not the right policy. The policy is wait till your child goes to school, right? So that leaves a ton of room for not vaccinating your child. It's till your child goes to school. And most of those policies have exemptions. Nearly every state, with the exception of California, I think, presently have an exemption of some sort that you can claim. In some states, it's more difficult to claim an exemption. You have to go to court, sue an affidavit, but you do have to show if you show an exemption, you can not get your child vaccinated. We also shouldn't forget that in the US, there's all kinds of systemic problems. The healthcare system, there's poor access in some areas. There are people who can't afford to get vaccinated because they don't have the money to do so. So that might affect the stats as well. That is different from some of those countries like Rwanda, where there's a targeted effort by the government to eliminate disease. And most of it comes from the work of international organizations helping out to try and eradicate diseases in other places.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers today. If you're interested in finding out more about the Public Science Institute or maybe have a couple questions that were left unanswered, feel free to email us and we can connect with the speakers and get you a response. Other than that, thank you.